Hello and welcome to Urban Farming's classroom. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to make your own mushroom grain spawn. Mushroom grain spawn is basically a substrate or material on which mushroom mycelium is living. We then use that material to inoculate a bulk growth substrate from which eventually we'll grow our mushrooms. So it's really, really important to get this stage of the production cycle right. But why would you grow your own mushroom grain spawn? Well, apart from the fact that it's loads of fun, it helps you to understand the full cultivation process, and that'll help with your growing later on. Additionally, if you're only growing at sort of small to medium scale, it's a good way of saving a few quid because buying mushroom spawn online can often work out quite expensive. I would say though that if you were looking to step up into a more commercial level and looking to expand on this, that it's often a good idea to buy online because then that saves the need for high-spec specialist equipment. But growing mushroom spawn at this level is great for a small to medium-sized cultivator. Let's get stuck in. There's no doubt about it that growing your own spawn is a step up on using something like a mushroom growing kit, because as you can see there's more pieces of equipment and it's a much more involved process that you really do need to understand before you start. So first things first, you need to choose a good substrate, and we're going to use rye grain today, but you can use a host of other sort of cereal crops like millet, wheat, anything like that will do, even popcorn some people say. The idea being that it's a material that you can sterilize through pressure cooking and then is a really good nutritious base on which your mycelium can live. So today we're going to be growing in jars. These are great because they are pretty resilient, reusable, and they work well with the pressure cooking system. You can also use specialist growing bags, but if you're going to purchase bags, make sure that they are suitable. And by that I mean that they can withstand high temperatures and pressure, and that they also have a suitable filter patch. Now it's the same thing for the jars or for the bags. You need to have a filter that's at most 0.2 microns, because at this stage of the life cycle, the mycelium will be very prone to contamination. Although a glass jar is just a glass jar, what we've got on here are some specialist lids. You'll notice that there's the filter patch here, which allows oxygen exchange to create a healthy environment for mycelium, whilst blocking other microorganisms from entering. But we've also got a self-sealing port. And because we're going to be using liquid culture today, it's really important that you have a suitable self-sealing port, again, to stop contamination entering after we've added our liquid culture. These lids are ones that you can purchase online, but it's worth mentioning that you can also make your own at home, which again is another way that you can save a few pennies. So what I've got here is a liquid culture of some oyster mushroom spawn. Oyster mushrooms is a great option for the beginner because it's really fast growing, aggressive, and can withstand contamination quite nicely, so that's a great way to start. So we're using a liquid culture syringe. You can also get liquid culture in pots, in which case you need to provide a separate sterile syringe. So if you are just starting out, I definitely advise getting it in a syringe. It's a really, really easy way to get going. But what is liquid culture? Well, liquid culture is basically just a nutritious liquid in which mycelium is living. This has been prepared in a lab environment, so I know it's really sterile and it's not going to introduce any unwanted contaminants onto our grain. As well as liquids like this, you can also do grain-to-grain transfers for making your own spawn, and you can also get some solid mother culture for some varieties. But like I say, today we're going to be focusing on the liquid because it's super easy for the beginner. Moving on to the elephant in the room, it's our pressure cooker. A unit like this will probably cost you around about 200 quid, but it's well worth the investment because of what it enables you to do. You know, beyond making grain, you can make agar plates, you can sterilize equipment, so it's a brilliant, brilliant piece of kit. And what we're trying to do with this is create an environment that kills off any competing microorganisms or other mushroom spores from our grain. Now, to achieve that, it needs to be able to maintain temperatures of around about 120 degrees, 15 psi, for over 2 hours. So this is definitely not a piece of kit that you can DIY build. It's not an absolute must-have, but I do like to use some kitchen foil just to wrap the top of the jars and make sure that no liquid gets on the filter, because if the filter becomes moist, then it can sometimes interfere with its capacity to work. So moving on over here, we've got our boiling pot and an induction hob, although any old hob will do. This is basically going to be for simmering our grain, helping it to take on moisture and getting it ready to go into the pressure cooker. And then last but not least, good old friend isopropyl alcohol. We're going to be using this on pretty much all of the equipment as we go along, on our hands, on the workspace. It's probably one of the easiest ways in which you can mess up your grain spawn by introducing another microorganism that causes contamination. So it's really, really important that you take hygiene seriously all the way through the process, and it will help you to have success. So normally when you purchase grains like this, they'll arrive dried. So the first thing that we need to do is to hydrate them a little bit. So I'm just going to take these grains, put them in a pan, and then cover them with normal tap or just generally cold water and leave them to soak overnight. 12 to 18 hours is sufficient. You definitely don't want to leave them for any more than 24 hours though, because then the grains might actually start to germinate. It's a good idea not to fill your pan all the way to the top, because while soaking, the grains are going to expand, so you need to allow room for that. So I've been soaking these grains here overnight, and we're just going to drain them into a colander. And once we've drained that, we'll just allow that to sit there for 20 minutes or so to make sure that all of the excess water's rinsed off. And we're then going to rinse the grain with some fresh water just to remove any extra starch. So what I've done now is I've taken our soaked and washed grains and added them back into a boiling pot. I've then recovered them with fresh water. I'm just going to bring it back up to a simmer. Once it reaches that point, I'm going to leave it simmering for 15 minutes. You don't want to turn it into a really aggressive rolling boil, because we're not trying to cook the grain. We're just trying to add a bit more moisture and soften them a little bit so the mycelium can run through it and digest the material really easily. So living on these grains might be some pretty hardcore microorganisms and other fungal spores that are really heat resistant. So whilst we don't want to soak the grains for so long that they germinate and split themselves, we do want to soak them long enough to germinate these other spores and make them more susceptible to the sterilisation step. Cool, so I've cooked up our grain, simmered it for 15 minutes, and we're just going to tip it into the sink and just let it cool off naturally. The end product that you want is a fairly dried grain, so that when you add it into your jars for pressure cooking, it doesn't turn into a mush. So I'm going to spread that out nice and evenly, not with my hand, with a spoon. And like I say, we'll leave this for a couple of hours, and just to allow the heat to evaporate off all of the excess moisture. The more that you can spread it out, the quicker evaporation will work, and the swifter you'll be moving on to the next step. So check it out. I thought that it'd be worth showing you up close what the grain looks like at different stages throughout the process. You can see here that this is fresh grain. It's bone dry, not a very good environment for your mycelium to thrive in. In the middle here, we've got some grain that's been soaking for around about 18 hours. It's far more moist, it's about double the size, but it's still not quite ready. And then over here is our sort of finished product. So this is grain that had been soaking for 18 hours and then has been simmered for 15 minutes. And you can see that it's really well hydrated, it's nice and puffy, but it also hasn't started to split and turn mushy, because whilst you want it to be nice and soft for your mycelium, you don't want it to just turn into a wet clump in the pressure cooker. So that's it, we're now ready for pressure cooking. I've filled the jar 3/4 full with grain. I've left a couple of inch gap at the top to allow enough room for shaking later on in the process. I've then put on the lid, added the foil cap, and now we're going to load it up into the pressure cooker. Pressure cookers are hot and at high pressure, and therefore are pretty dangerous. So make sure that you always set these up as per your manufacturer's instructions. What we're going to do now is just bring this up to 15 psi. It's about 120, 125 degrees. And we're just going to hold it there for 2 to 2.5 hours. It's really important that you reach 15 psi before you start your timer. That way you can guarantee that you're going to properly sterilise your grain, and it's a great environment for your mycelium. And there we have it. We've got our sterilised grain. We've allowed it to cool back down to room temperature, and we're edging ever closer to the moment of truth where we inoculate the grain with our liquid culture. These things are really easy to use. They come pre-prepared, which is brilliant. However, it is good practice just to give it a quick shake before we do our inoculation, just to make sure that the mycelium is evenly distributed throughout the liquid. We're going to push the needle through the injection port and then add around about 2 ml of liquid culture. And that's it, we've successfully inoculated our grain. The next step now is to find a suitable place for incubation, and what you're looking for is a nice dark place with temperatures anywhere between sort of 20 and 25 degrees, so warm covered or just tucked out the way in the house is perfect. Something to avoid is placing the jar next to any direct heat sources, so for example a radiator or actually touching a boiler, because the fluctuations in temperature will stress out the mycelium and that will slow down your growth. One other little thing to mention is that if you are to be inoculating multiple jars, then it's a good idea to flame your needle between inoculations just to make sure it's completely free from contamination. Depending on the variety and depending on how well you've maintained the correct conditions, it might only take 2 or 3 weeks for your grain to become fully colonized by the mycelium. But another good way of speeding it up is by giving the grain a shake once it's colonized around about 30 to 50%. That redistributes it and gives the mycelium a kick so that it goes on and grows much faster. And there you have it, it's our final product, it's our grain spawn. You can now either use this to inoculate bulk substrate and go on to grow mushrooms, or we can store it for later use. For stuff like grey oyster mushrooms, that would be 2 degrees, but there are the occasional peculiar one like pink oyster, which must be stored at 10. So make sure that you're aware of that ahead of putting your grain into storage. Before we move on though, we do need to give it a visual inspection and just make sure that the grain isn't either contaminated or stressed. What you're looking for, signs of green mold or buildup of metabolites, which is a sort of jelly-like liquid. I'm going to go and use this to inoculate a bucket grow. I hope you found this video useful and subscribe to our channel for more urban farming content.